So hi, I'm here to tell you about the Computation of Language Laboratory, the CoLaLab, which I run at UC Irvine. This is me down here in the corner, Lisa Pearl, a professor in the Department of Language Science and in Cognitive Sciences. And this is specifically for those of you coming to the Language Science recruitment visit on March 2nd, but it's also just sort of a general state of affairs for CoLaLab in 2020. So in general, the main focus of CoLaLab is information extraction, and we look at that in the areas of language acquisition primarily and computational sociolinguistics are our two main areas here. And really, for the graduate level research in the lab, it's really focused on language acquisition. So all of the graduate research action really happens in that area rather than computational sociolinguistics. And so when we talk about language acquisition, the question is, how do children acquire the knowledge about language that they do from the language data that they have, right? That's the information they're trying to extract. And you might be asking yourself, well, why language acquisition? Like, what's so great about language acquisition? And the answer is that basically babies are amazing at learning language. And so we sort of captured in elements of this particular comic. So we have Dinosaur One saying, you know who's really the coolest is dang old babies, because you can take a baby, put it down in a room full of complete strangers making crazy noises, and that baby will do the following: presuppose those noises have meaning, independently invent the very idea of language, and then learn to communicate in that language. They will stone cold deduce rules of grammar from observation alone, and they'll do it way faster than an adult ever could. And Dinosaur 2 says, well, but babies are stupid. They crawl off of cliffs if given half a chance. And Dinosaur 1 says, like, that's absolutely right. Our offspring are idiot savants who think, oh, lexical categories, I'll definitely come up with that idea entirely alone. And oh no, time to cry for 6 hours while simultaneously inventing subject-verb agreement. And they're coming up with these thoughts without even having a language to think them in, right? So that's it in a nutshell, right? And so, when you think about, okay, they're learning all this stuff about language, what exactly do you know when you know language? What is it that babies are learning? And the answer is a lot, actually. So for example, you know how to identify words influence speech in your native language or languages, something called speech segmentation. So if you have this audio signal sort of represented pictorially here, you automatically convert that into a representation that may go through various layers of sort of abstraction until you recognize it, and from your perspective, almost instantaneously, as maybe the sequence, what a pretty kitty, right? Even though, again, out there in the world is just this mushy, messy audio signal. You've segmented that speech, right? You also know how to pronounce words, the phonology of your language. So in English, for example, you would pronounce this word kitty and not kitty. Kitty is some weirdo pronunciation that is not correct, right? So you know that as well about your language. You also know that certain words can behave like other words. For example, if I have the phrase, what a pretty blank, we can say, what a pretty penguin, what a pretty kitty, what a pretty owl. And the reason we can say all these things is because they are the same type of word, the same category of word, which is a noun. So you've clumped these all together. Again, not to your conscious knowledge, but you've clumped them all together such that you know they can all fit in that slot. What a pretty blank, because that's what certain types of nouns can do. You also know how to interpret words in context using your knowledge of syntax and semantics. So say, oh, look, a pretty kitty. Look, there's another one. Another what? Well, a lot of people say, well, another pretty kitty. That's certainly possible. Other people say, no, just any other kitty. It doesn't really have to be pretty. It's kind of an ugly kitty, right? But it's not a kitty. But importantly, it's not another wombat, right? You are very clear that one, in this case, really ought to be pretty kitty or kitty, and that's using your knowledge of syntax and semantics together. You also know how to put words together to make phrases using your knowledge of syntax. So if I say, look at this kitty is black, this kitty is cute, and we have maybe a couple of different ways of talking about this kitty. You could say it's a black cute kitty, or a cute black kitty. And it turns out that English speakers really, really strongly prefer cute black kitty over black cute kitty, right? So that's your knowledge of syntax at play. Here's another example of syntax, is knowing how to put words together to ask questions. So Lily thinks this kitty is pretty. Great. And this kitty was bought as a present for somebody. Who does Lily think the kitty for is pretty? You can't actually ask that. You know that that's what you want to ask, but you can't ask it that way. That's your knowledge of syntax telling you can't put words together that way, right? Here's some knowledge about pragmatics. You know how to identify the right interpretation in context. Look at these kitties. Some of them say are sitting on stairs, some of them are not, right? That's our collection of kitties. All right, so here's what, looking at this scene, I'm going to say to you, look, every kitty didn't sit on the stairs. And you have to think about what that means in this context, right? Well, there are actually two possible interpretations. So one, no kitties sat on the stairs. Two, not all the kitties sat on the stairs. And if you look at this scenario, you're like, well, actually most adults will prefer to interpret it as not all the kitties sat on the stairs. Every kitty didn't sit on the stairs means not all, rather than none or no kitties. Why? Because you have this understanding about the rules of conversation about pragmatics where you think people like to say true things. And the true thing in this context is that not all the kitties sat on stairs. Some of them did, and some of them didn't. So that's why you prefer that interpretation, right? Okay, so this is a lot of different knowledge, right? And the question is, how exactly do children learn all this, right? That's language acquisition. We know, in fact, that they do it pretty quickly. In fact, a lot of the linguistic system is already known by age 4. And the interesting thing is they do this mostly without explicit instruction, right? Just kind of by observation alone, going back to our dinosaur comic, right? So what the children seem to be doing is extracting patterns and making generalizations from the surrounding data, mostly just by hearing examples of what's allowed in the language. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. What's so hard about that? And the answer is that there are often many ways to generalize beyond the input, and most of them aren't right, right? So for example, let's think about the word birdie, which is maybe a child register version of the word bird, of course, right? And so here, what a pretty birdie. That's your example of a birdie. Oh, look, a birdie. Oh, here's another example of a birdie. Oh, look at that birdie. Oh, here's another example of birdie. So from this, what does birdie mean? If these are your examples of birdie, how do you generalize beyond your input, right? And so one hypothesis is that, birdies are blue things, right? Right, so these things, this blue butterfly and this blue fish should also be birdies. Well, clearly that's not right, but that's a reasonable way to generalize, right? Given your birdie examples. Here's another one. Things on branches, right? Because, hey, all the examples you saw were things on branches. So this frog on a branch and this cat on a branch also ought to be birdies. Of course they're not, right? Because that's another incorrect way to generalize beyond the input. So what is a birdie? Well, it's whatever sort of cluster of features end up including all of these different examples of things as birdies as well. But, that's the problem, is how do you generalize beyond the input in just the right way, right? This is an induction problem. That's what it's called when you're trying to generalize beyond your input. These kinds of induction problems are everywhere in development, including language acquisition, right? So language acquisition is really about solving a lot of induction problems, and in CoLaLab we often use computational cognitive modeling to investigate the learning strategies that children use to solve induction problems. So let's talk a little bit about modeling. So what does it mean to model something, right? Well, it's a scientific technique like running an experiment. So saying, I want to model thing is just like saying, I want to run an experiment about thing. I mean, great, that's a fine plan. But the important question is, why are you doing it? What question are you trying to answer? Because once you know what question you're trying to answer, you can design the right test of it, whether that's a model or an experiment or something else entirely, right? So, okay, what questions should we be using models for? And so here's my take on it from a recent our book chapter really that's coming out. These questions tend to concern the process of acquisition that yields adult knowledge. That is, how exactly acquisition proceeds using particular learning strategies, right? And the importance of theory is that an informative model of acquisition is basically the embodiment of a specific theory about acquisition. Like that is what you are building, right? So therefore, you need to first have a theory about how acquisition works, and then the model can be used to make all the components of that acquisition theory explicit, evaluate whether it actually works, and determine precisely what makes it work or not work, right, depending on what you find. So, I mean, it often turns out, right, when we think about making the components of a theory explicit, that the acquisition theories that seem explicit to humans don't actually specify all the details necessary to implement the strategies these theories describe. Like, we think they're got all the details in them, but it turns out they don't, and you don't realize that until you actually try to implement it in some kind of program or some kind of algorithm. Just as an example, let's talk about one type of acquisition theory, which involves learning linguistic structure from signals or triggers, as it were, in the input. So here's a specific example. The trigger for WH movement in a language is seeing a WH word like what in English in a position different from where it's understood. So what, in the question, what did the penguin do, right? The penguin is doing something. What is that something? What did the penguin do? That's a trigger, for example, of WH movement, right? The WH word is in a position different from where it's understood, which is the object of do. Okay, so what do children need to know or be able to do in order to recognize the appropriate WH movement trigger in their input? Well, all right, let's kind of think about this. Well, they need to know that a certain word like what is one of these special WH words. They need to be able to do reliable segmentation of words in the utterance in order to recognize that WH word not appearing where it's understood. They need to remember the fronted WH word what in the utterance reliably enough to update their internal hypothesis about WH structure. They need to know to ignore utterances where the WH word doesn't move. This happens actually quite a bit in English, like in things called echo questions. The penguin did what, right? The what is in the position where it's understood, right? So these are just some of the things, right, that children need to know or be able to do. You can probably think of others, right? But the point is that that's a lot of different stuff that maybe the people who came up with this theory weren't thinking about, right? And we also can consider the case of non-movement, which is called WH in situ, so WH in place, for languages like, say, Mandarin, Chinese, and Japanese. So does this WH in situ option have a trigger too? If so, what is it? If it doesn't have a trigger, is that somehow the default option, like don't move the WH word, and that gets overwritten by the presence of these WH movement triggers? And if that's the case, okay, great. You're looking for triggers, like how many triggers does it take to override that default option? If there are no defaults, okay, forget defaults, but WH in situ also has no trigger, then somehow you're going to have to reason about whether your language is in situ or with movement, right? Maybe you're using probabilistic reasoning about what you expect to be or not be there to decide your language is in situ. How much evidence does that take, right? Like, how does that work, right? These are the questions that come up when you try to make that theory of triggers for WH movement explicit, right? Okay, so we come back to, the importance of theory. We're making all the components of that acquisition theory explicit in our model, and then we want to evaluate whether it actually works and determine what precisely makes it work or not work, right? So basically, right, once you have it specific enough to implement in a computational model, we can then evaluate it by comparing the predictions it generates against the empirical data available from children. And we have two basic outcomes, right? Either the model predictions match children's data, great, or they don't match children's data, right? These are your two basic options. So what happens if the model predictions match children's data? Well, we then have an existence proof that the acquisition theory as implemented in that model is a way that acquisition could proceed, right? It doesn't rule out alternative acquisition theories. It's just, hey, this is a way it could happen. I have shown you exactly how that process could work, right? Now, if the model predictions don't match children's data, this is evidence against that acquisition theory as implemented by the model, because remember, a model often specifies components of a theory that the original theory didn't, right? So if this particular theory implementation doesn't work, maybe it's a problem with those components and not the theory more broadly, right? But, this is the kind of thing that we can explore. If you have an implemented model, whether it succeeds or fails, you can look inside it to determine what exactly makes it work or not work. And of course, this is something much more difficult to do with children's minds, right? Like, what's sort of the value of the models. We can peek inside and see what makes everything turn, right? So for example, suppose that we have a successful model of the acquisition of WH movement from triggers, right? What did the penguin do? Hey, the what has moved from after the do to where we actually pronounce it. Great. Okay, we have a working model. So we can look inside. We can see if it's important for English children to ignore, say, W echo questions where there's no WH movement, like the penguin did. What, do you have to ignore them, or can you get by even if they're in the input? Or how necessary is a Mandarin Chinese like default WH in situ value, right? Do you need a default, or can you learn that value without having it as a default, right? Like, you can look inside and see in your implemented model what the case is for each of these questions, right? If the model's predictions don't match children's behavior without these specific components, we can say they're necessary components of the learning strategy that this theory describes, and we can explain exactly why. So in the case of filtering out the echo questions, they're filtering the input, they're making it a cleaner signal, as it were. Or if you need to have a default for WH in situ, they're helping the child navigate the hypothesis space of WH in situ or WH movement, like the options that are available. We can say what they're doing, right? And that is so valuable. This is really, really useful, right? So basically then, modeling can be used as a tool for both developing and refining acquisition theories. And an acquisition theory is usually going to include two sort of types of theories. One is a theory of the learning process itself, the step-by-step procedure, and the other is the representations that have to be learned. And an informative model is really going to be incorporating both of them. So in CoLaLab, we hopefully build informative models about a lot of different stuff, like which learning strategies could children be using, and hey, what kind of learning biases do they need to have, right? For example, do they need to be biased towards a default or not, or other, depending on the particular acquisition problem you're looking at. Which knowledge representations are learnable, are acquirable by children, and which aren't, right? And when do children learn different aspects of the linguistic system, right? Because the model can actually, again, you can peer inside and see what representations the model has, even if that's hard to do in children on the basis of their behavior. So we can do that with modeling. And what factors affect children's observable behavior, right? Are they, again, this is something where if you see a particular behavior in an experiment, but you're not sure exactly why it's occurring, you can build a model that can replicate that behavior, and then you can look inside that model and see what factors are actually having the impact, right? So again, these are lots of different questions that we try to answer, that we build informative, cognitive, computational models about in CoLaLab. And that is really just kind of a wrap up for now of CoLaLab 2020. Again, the major focus for the graduate level research is in this language acquisition area, although we also, again, do some work in computational sociolinguistics.